She did not cry. That was the part no one expected. Elizabeth Harrington stood at the edge of the church steps on the hottest morning Virginia had seen in years, her white gloves still pressed together, her spine perfectly straight, and she did not shed a single tear. Inside, the man who had once whispered, "You are the only woman I will ever choose," was placing a ring on her younger sister's finger. And the entire town was watching Elizabeth's face, waiting for her to break. She never did. If you've ever been made to feel invisible by the people who were supposed to love you most, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and follow Elizabeth's journey all the way to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Virginia summer of 1812. The morning of the Crawford Harrington wedding was the kind of morning that made people believe God approved of everything happening beneath that blue sky. The sun came up hard and golden over the Blue Ridge Mountains, and by 9 o'clock the heat was already pressing down on the red clay roads like a warm hand. Butterflies moved lazily through the rose gardens outside the First Episcopal Church of Harrington County. Carriages lined the road from the Iron Gate all the way back toward the Crawford estate, black lacquered doors, gleaming horses stamping in the dust, coachmen in their best livery sweating quietly in the shade. The entire county had come. Because when Nathaniel Crawford married, it was an event. When the wealthiest landowner in all of Virginia took a bride, every family within 50 miles made certain their faces were seen in that church. And they were all there, every last one of them, watching Elizabeth Harrington stand alone at the top of the church steps. She had arrived early. She always arrived early for everything. It was one of those habits her mother had pressed into her like iron into soft fabric when she was a little girl. Be first, Elizabeth. Be ready, Elizabeth. Be useful, Elizabeth. And she had been for 26 years without complaint, without pause, without once asking whether any of it was fair. She stood very still. Her dress was the pale blue of a winter sky, not the ivory or cream that the occasion might have called for, because she had understood when she dressed that morning that this was not her day to wear white. Her dark hair was pulled up neatly beneath a narrow-brimmed bonnet. Her gloves were white. Her back was straight, and she did not cry. Mrs. Beaumont, the wife of the county magistrate, leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind her fan. Elizabeth heard it anyway. She had always had very good hearing, which had been both a blessing and a curse in a family that said one thing to her face and quite another behind closed doors. "Poor dear," Mrs. Beaumont said. I suppose she always knew she wasn't quite the right sort for a man like Nathaniel Crawford. Elizabeth's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough to be noticeable if anyone had been paying close enough attention. No one was. That, too, was familiar. 3 months earlier, Elizabeth had been the one Nathaniel Crawford rode out to see on Tuesday and Thursday mornings before the heat of the day made the roads difficult. He had come to the Harrington estate with business in mind. Her father's land bordered the western edge of his own holdings, and there had been a long-standing disagreement about water rights along Miller's Creek. But it had been Elizabeth, not her father, who had sat across the study desk from him and laid out the maps, who had explained the drainage patterns with quiet precision, who had proposed a solution that protected both families without either of them surrendering an acre. Nathaniel had looked at her across that desk with something she had mistaken foolishly for admiration. "Miss Harrington," he had said very slowly, as though he was recalculating something he thought he already understood. "You know this land better than your father does." "Someone has to," she said simply without bitterness, because it was simply true. He had laughed. A real laugh, not the polished performative one he used in company. And Elizabeth had felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't even known was wound tight. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Thursday after that, and the Tuesday after that. He stopped talking only about business. He asked her what she read. He asked her opinion on the proposed road that the county commissioners wanted to push through the northern fields. He asked her what she thought about the tobacco prices falling, and what she reckoned the smart families would shift their land toward in the next decade. He told her about his father's debts, which no one else in Virginia knew about. He told her about the night he had sat at his father's deathbed and promised in the dark to hold the Crawford name together with his bare hands if he had to. "You don't have to hold it alone," Elizabeth told him once quietly near the end of a long afternoon when the shadows in the study had grown long and the candles had burned low without either of them noticing. He had looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite name. Then he had said, "No, I don't reckon I do." She had believed him. That was the part she could not forgive herself for, not the betrayal itself, but the believing. She had not been naive. She had never been naive a day in her life. She had grown up watching her mother manage a household and a husband and a society's worth of expectations with exhausted, invisible competence. She had grown up knowing that the world was not designed to be fair to women who were smart, but not decorative, capable, but not beautiful in the way the world required beauty to look. She had known all of that, and she had believed him anyway. Caroline Harrington was 22 years old, and the kind of pretty that made rooms go quiet when she walked in. She had their mother's coloring fair skin, and gold hair, and blue eyes that caught the light in a way that made men forget what they had been saying. She laughed easily and often. She played the pianoforte with a lightness of touch that was more feeling than technique. She wore her dresses just slightly lower than their mother approved of, and she tilted her chin at a particular angle when she was speaking to a man she wanted to impress, and it worked every single time with a reliability that Elizabeth had observed her whole life, with a complicated mixture of admiration and resignation. Caroline was not a bad person. Elizabeth had never believed she was a bad person. She was simply a person who had never been asked to want less, and so she never had. When Nathaniel Crawford began riding out to the Harrington estate on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, Caroline had been visiting their cousin in Richmond. She returned in early April, a week after Elizabeth and Nathaniel's conversations had shifted into something neither of them had formally named, but both of them understood. Elizabeth remembered the exact moment her sister walked into the parlor. Nathaniel had been standing by the fireplace gesturing at something he was describing about the north pasture. He had been mid-sentence. He stopped. It was not dramatic. He did not drop anything. He did not stare. He was too controlled for that. Nathaniel Crawford had been trained since birth to keep his face composed in company. But he stopped mid-sentence, and there was a half-second of silence, and then he said, "Miss Harrington, both of you, pardon me, I wasn't aware you had a sister, Miss Elizabeth." "Everyone is always unaware of that," Caroline said brightly, settling into the chair nearest the fire, as though she had been born to sit in it. "I'm the one who got lost in Richmond. I'm Caroline." "William Crawford," Nathaniel said. "I know who you are," Caroline said. She smiled at him. "The whole county knows who you are." Elizabeth watched her sister smile at Nathaniel Crawford, and she felt with a clarity that was almost physical the ground shift very slightly beneath her feet. The engagement. The real one. The one the county talked about in drawing rooms and at market stalls and over Sunday dinners was announced 6 weeks later. Elizabeth had been in the kitchen garden when her mother came to find her. Her mother, Catherine Harrington, was a woman who had been beautiful once, in exactly the way Caroline was beautiful now, and who had translated that beauty into a successful marriage and a comfortable life, and a deeply private grief about everything she had been required to set aside in order to achieve those things. She was not a cruel woman. She was a practical one, which Elizabeth had sometimes thought was worse. "Your father has agreed to it," her mother said, standing at the edge of the garden path, not quite stepping onto the soil in her good shoes. "Mr. Crawford has asked for Caroline's hand." Elizabeth was holding a pair of gardening shears. She did not move. "I see," she said. "Elizabeth." "I said I see Mama." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "He's a very important man, Elizabeth, and your sister Caroline has always been the one who—" "Who what?" Elizabeth asked. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. She had always been proud of her ability to keep her voice even. Her mother didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Elizabeth had heard the unfinished version of that sentence her entire life. Caroline has always been the one who makes things easier, who makes the right impression, Who fits the picture frame? You, Elizabeth, have always been the one who is useful, who is capable, who takes care of things. And useful and capable do not sit in the parlor of a Virginia estate as the mistress of the house. They sit in the kitchen garden with dirt on their gloves. I understand, Mama, Elizabeth said. She went back to her pruning. Her hands did not shake until she was certain her mother had gone back inside. The accident happened 2 weeks before the wedding was supposed to be announced publicly. Elizabeth heard about it from the kitchen girl, who had heard it from the stable boy, who had heard it from one of the Crawford footmen. Nathaniel Crawford had been thrown from his horse on the river road. He had struck his head. He had been unconscious for the better part of a day. When he woke, the Crawford household had been told he did not remember the past several months. Just gone. Like smoke. Poor man, Mrs. Beaumont said when the news made its way to the social circles. What a terrible thing. And he was just about to be married. He still is, someone else said. He asked for Miss Caroline as soon as he was lucid enough to speak. Even without his memory, he chose her. There was a murmur of appreciation around the room at that. How romantic. How proof positive that some things were written so deeply in a man's soul that even injury couldn't erase them. Elizabeth had sat very still in the corner of that drawing room and said nothing. Because she had known with the same quiet precision with which she understood drainage patterns and crop rotations and the management of difficult men in business negotiations that something about this story was not right. She simply hadn't been able to prove it. Not then. 3 days before the wedding, she went to see him. It was not the sort of thing a woman was supposed to do to call on a man unannounced alone without the buffer of a social occasion to make it proper. Elizabeth knew that. She had known it and gone anyway, because there were times in a person's life when the rules of propriety were less important than the truth. The Crawford butler had shown her to the parlor with a look of carefully managed surprise that she pretended not to notice. She sat in the formal chair nearest the window and folded her hands and waited. Nathaniel came in 15 minutes later. He was walking steadily enough. The bruising at his temple had faded to a greenish yellow. He was dressed well, as he always was, coat-pressed cravat tied with precision. He looked to anyone observing from the outside like a man who had recovered. He looked at her with polite, pleasant blankness. "Miss Harrington," he said, "how kind of you to call. Your family is well, I hope?" Elizabeth studied his face for a long moment. "You know who I am," she said quietly. Not a question. Nathaniel's expression did not change. Not by a fraction. That was, she realized the tell, because she had sat across a desk from this man for months, and she knew his face, and she knew that when something surprised him, there was a very small, very quick shift in his eyes, like a card being turned. There was no shift, because he had known she was coming. He had had time to compose himself. "Of course," he said pleasantly. "You're Miss Elizabeth Harrington, Caroline's older sister. We met briefly, I understand, before my accident." "Briefly," Elizabeth said. "Yes." She looked at him. He looked back at her with steady, polite, impenetrable courtesy. And in that moment, Elizabeth understood everything she needed to understand. He remembered her. He remembered every Tuesday morning and every Thursday afternoon and every conversation and every moment she had allowed herself to believe something was beginning between them. He remembered all of it. She could see it in the very perfection of his composure, in the effort it required for him to look at her like a stranger. He remembered, and he had chosen this anyway. She rose from her chair. "I won't keep you from your preparations," she said. Her voice was exactly as even as it had been in the kitchen garden talking to her mother. She was very proud of that. "I wish you and my sister every happiness, Mr. Crawford." She walked to the door. She had her hand on the frame when she stopped, not because she couldn't help it, but because she made a deliberate choice to stop and turn to look at him one more time. "Nathaniel," she said. "Not Mr. Crawford. Just his name." The way she had said it in the study in the evenings when the candles burned low. His jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. "Whatever you needed me to be," she said quietly. "I hope Caroline is that for you. I truly do." She left before he could answer. She walked the 3 miles back to the Harrington estate alone on the river road in the summer heat, and she did not allow herself to cry until she was well enough away from the Crawford house that no one would see it. She gave herself 20 minutes. Then she stopped, and she dried her face with the back of her hand, and she kept walking. The morning of the wedding, her father found her in the front hallway, already dressed, her traveling case at her feet. Her father, Thomas Harrington, was a man who was not unkind so much as deeply fundamentally absent. He had been present in the house for Elizabeth's entire life without ever quite being present to her. He had seen to it that she was educated, clothed, and provided for. He had relied on her management of the estate for years without formally acknowledging it. He had watched her set aside what she wanted over and over again, with the vague approval of a man who thought he was raising a particularly sensible child. He looked at the traveling case, then at Elizabeth. "What is this?" he said. "I'm leaving Papa." "Elizabeth." "I have written to Aunt Frances in Lexington," Elizabeth said. "She has agreed to have me. I'll be taking the afternoon stage from Charlottesville. You cannot leave on the morning of your sister's wedding." "The ceremony is at noon," Elizabeth said. "I'll be gone before then." Her father's face did something complicated. She recognized that look. It was the look of a man who had spent a long time not thinking very hard about certain things, and who was now being required to think about them, and who did not entirely appreciate the requirement. "Elizabeth, first you understand, this has been difficult." "Has it?" she asked. And she heard in her own voice something she had never let herself say before, a very quiet, very controlled edge. "You understood it was difficult. Your sister's happiness. I have spent my entire life being asked to give up things for Caroline's happiness, Papa," Elizabeth said. "Her portion of the schoolroom, her choice of horse, her turn with every opportunity that came to this family. I have given them willingly because I love her and because I believe that love required it." She stopped. "I am no longer willing." Her father stared at her. "I am going to Aunt Frances," Elizabeth said. "I will write when I arrive. I ask that you not try to persuade me otherwise." "What will people say?" he said finally, with the helpless reflexiveness of a man who had organized his entire life around that question. "They'll say whatever they like," Elizabeth said. "They always have." She picked up her traveling case. She opened the front door herself. The heat came in like a wall, that deep Virginia summer heat, thick with honeysuckle and red clay dust, and the sound of insects in the long grass. She stood in the doorway for one moment. She thought about 26 years in this house. She thought about the study where she had managed the accounts. She thought about the kitchen garden. She thought about Tuesday mornings and candles burning low. She thought about the way Nathaniel Crawford had looked at her from across the desk that very first afternoon with something she had chosen to call admiration. Then she stepped across the threshold and pulled the door closed behind her. The wedding bells began ringing at noon. Elizabeth was already 2 miles down the road, her face turned toward the mountains, walking into whatever came next. She did not know it, then could not have known it then, but she was not walking away from her life. She was walking toward it. The Harrington County gossip lasted approximately 4 days. Mrs. Beaumont said it was disgraceful Elizabeth absconding on her sister's wedding day. Mrs. Hartley said she couldn't entirely blame the girl. Judge Pruitt said it was nobody's business, and his wife said that was easy for a man to say. The stable hands said Miss Elizabeth had always had more backbone than people gave her credit for, and they said it quietly, but they said it with approval. Then, Caroline Crawford née Harrington appeared at the midsummer garden party on the arm of her husband in a cream silk dress with Brussels lace at the collar, and the county turned its attention to the new Mrs. Crawford, and Elizabeth Harrington became a footnote, which was, she supposed, exactly what she had always been. Aunt Frances was her mother's older sister, a widow of 15 years, who lived in a modest but comfortable house on the edge of Lexington with 2 maids, an excellent cook, and a stubbornness of character that had apparently been distributed very unequally between her and her younger sister. She was 61 years old, small and sharp-eyed with white hair she wore in a no-nonsense knot, and a tendency to speak her mind in a way that Elizabeth had always found deeply refreshing. When Elizabeth stepped off the stage in Lexington, dusty and exhausted, and still holding herself very straight, Aunt Frances looked her over once and said, "You took your time." "Ma'am, I've been expecting you to leave that house for 5 years," her aunt said, turning to lead her inside. "I'm only surprised it took this long." Elizabeth followed her up the front steps. "You never said anything." "You weren't ready to hear it." They went inside, and the maid brought tea, and Aunt Frances sat across from her niece and looked at her steadily. "What do you want to do now?" she said. It was such a simple question, so direct and so clean without preamble or implication or the kind of hedging that came with every question Elizabeth's mother had ever asked her. Elizabeth sat with it for a moment. "I want to be useful," she said reflexively. "You've been useful your whole life," Frances said. "I didn't ask what you could be for other people. I asked what you want." Elizabeth was quiet. Outside, the afternoon light lay golden across the Kentucky hills, and the heat shimmered at the edges, and somewhere down the road, a mockingbird was going through its entire repertoire without stopping. "I want to own something," Elizabeth said slowly. "Something that's mine, that no one can ask me to give away." Aunt Frances nodded once, like a woman who had been waiting a long time for her niece to say exactly that. "Well then," she said, "we'd better figure out how." There was a land auction the following Thursday. Aunt Frances had not mentioned it until Wednesday evening, when she set a folded notice on the supper table next to Elizabeth's plate and said simply, "Worth looking at." Elizabeth unfolded it. It was 40 acres in the lower river valley. Good soil, spring-fed, the notice said. The previous owner had died without heirs, and the estate was being settled by the county. The auction was being held at the courthouse at 10 in the morning. "I have some savings," Elizabeth said. "Not much. From the household accounts, Papa gave me a small commission over the years." "I know," her aunt said. "I also have savings. We can pool them if you're willing." Elizabeth looked up. "You would do that?" "I'm 61 years old and I have no children," Frances said briskly. "And I have been watching the women in this family give things away their entire lives. I would prefer to spend my money on something that grows." She picked up her fork. "Finish your supper. We'll need to be up early." Time. She met William Ashford at the auction. She did not know who he was then. He was simply a tall man in a plain coat standing near the back of the courthouse holding his hat and listening with the particular quality of stillness that she recognized, because she had it too, the stillness of someone who is paying careful attention while appearing to pay none at all. The 40 acres sold fast. There were 4 bidders, and the price climbed more quickly than Elizabeth had anticipated, and she felt with a cold clarity the moment when her combined funds with Frances would not be enough to go further. She dropped out. The tall man in the plain coat was not one of the 4 bidders. He hadn't bid at all. He watched the auction with his hat in his hands, and when it was over, he turned and found himself standing next to Elizabeth, who was folding the notice back into her reticule, with the composed expression of a woman who had just lost something and was not planning to make a scene about it. "You are watching the Johnson parcel," he said. It was a statement, not a question. Elizabeth glanced at him. "So were you," she said. "You didn't bid." "Price went too high too fast," he said. "Not worth it at that number?" "No," Elizabeth agreed. "It wasn't." There was a pause. Outside the courthouse windows, the Kentucky summer pressed bright and hot against the glass. "There's another parcel," the man said. 12 miles east. Better soil than the Johnson land. Spring runs year-round, but the current owner is difficult. He won't sell to just anyone." Elizabeth looked at him directly. "Why are you telling me this?" He looked back at her. His eyes were gray and steady, and she had the impression of a man who said what he meant, and meant what he said, an impression she had had before about someone else, and which she now approached with rather more caution than she once had. Because you were the only person in that room who knew what that land was actually worth, he said simply. The others were guessing. You knew. She studied him for the moment. William Ashford, he said, and offered his hand in the plain, direct way of a man who had grown up in places where formality was secondary to practicality. Elizabeth Harrington, she said, and shook it. He nodded once. The parcel east of town, he said. Owner's name is Garfield. He's stubborn, but he's not unreasonable. I can introduce you if you're interested. Why would you do that? She asked. You don't know me. No, he said. But I know good judgment when I see it. He settled his hat on his head and gave her a short, respectful nod. The nod of a man who was offering something without requiring anything in return, and walked out of the courthouse into the summer heat. Elizabeth stood where she was for a moment. Then she turned to Aunt Frances, who had been standing 3 paces behind her this entire time, with the expression of a woman who was doing her very best not to look smug. Don't, Elizabeth said. I didn't say a word, Frances said. You were thinking it very loudly. I was thinking, her aunt said mildly, that you just had a perfectly sensible conversation with a perfectly reasonable man about a perfectly good piece of land, and neither of you once talked about someone's sister. Elizabeth picked up her reticule. His name is Ashford, she said. I'm sure he's perfectly ordinary. Of course, said Frances. They walked out into the afternoon sun, and the heat settled around them thick and golden, and somewhere to the east, 12 miles down a river road, Elizabeth did not yet know there was a piece of land waiting for her. She did not know it was the beginning of everything, but her aunt walking beside her thought she might. The Garfield land was everything William Ashford had said it was, and Elizabeth knew it the moment she walked the boundary line with old Henry Garfield on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the courthouse auction. Garfield was 73 bow-legged and deeply suspicious of everyone which Elizabeth respected. He walked the property line ahead of her without waiting to see if she could keep up, pointed at things without explaining them, and said approximately 14 words in the first 20 minutes. Elizabeth said nothing at all. She simply watched and counted and calculated the way she had always done quietly, without announcement, building the picture in her mind, the way another woman might have built a needlepoint pattern stitch by careful stitch. When they reached the spring at the far northern corner, Garfield finally stopped and turned to look at her. Most folks who come out here, he said, spend the whole walk talking. I noticed, Elizabeth said. I've been counting. He squinted. Counting what? The mature oaks along the east boundary, the gradient of the slope toward the creek, the soil color variation between the high ground and the floodplain. She paused. This land has been rested at least 2 seasons. Someone smart owned it before you. Garfield was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My wife. I'm sorry. She knew land, he said, better than me. He looked at Elizabeth with eyes that were old and sharp and measuring. You know it too. I was raised managing an estate in Virginia, Elizabeth said. Not as a lady of the house, as the person who actually ran it. Something shifted in Garfield's face. Not quite a smile, he didn't look like a man who smiled often, but something in the neighborhood of recognition. Price I'm asking is firm, he said. I know. I can meet it. In full, not installments. In full. He nodded slowly. Come inside, he said. I'll have Mary bring coffee. They had the agreement drawn up by Friday. Aunt Frances signed as co-purchaser without ceremony, passing the pen across the kitchen table with the business-like efficiency of a woman transferring funds she had already mentally earmarked. Elizabeth signed below her. The lawyer, a young man named Pratt, who had clearly not expected to be conducting a land sale with 2 women, kept his face admirably neutral throughout. When he left, Elizabeth stood in Frances's kitchen and looked at the signed copy of the agreement, and felt something she could not immediately name. It was not happiness exactly. It was something steadier than happiness, something that didn't require anyone else's presence or permission to exist. Well, Frances said from across the table, you own something now. We own something, Elizabeth said. Her aunt waved a hand. I'm 61. I own enough. This is yours." Elizabeth looked down at the paper. Her name in her own handwriting on a document that meant something permanent and real and entirely hers. "I don't know quite what to do with this feeling," she admitted. "You'll learn," Frances said, and poured the coffee. She threw herself into the land the way she had thrown herself into everything her entire life, completely methodically without reservation, except that this time the completeness was for herself, and that made it feel entirely different from the inside. She hired 2 farmhands brothers named Caleb and Jonas Prentice, who were in their 20s and strong, and initially very uncertain about taking direction from a woman who was younger than both of them. That uncertainty lasted approximately 4 days, which was how long it took them to realize that Elizabeth Harrington knew what she was talking about down to the last detail and did not require their belief in order to be right. She mapped the drainage patterns. She tested the soil in 3 sections. She drew up a rotation plan that would rest the north field through the fall and put the south field into winter wheat. She negotiated with the grain merchant in town, a man named Dulles, who had the broad, settled confidence of someone who had never had to negotiate with a woman before, and discovered over the course of 45 very interesting minutes that it was not the experience he had anticipated. She drove a hard bargain. She got what she wanted. Caleb Prentice told his brother that evening that Miss Harrington was something else entirely, and Jonas said he reckoned he'd noticed. William Ashford came by the property 6 weeks after the sale. He arrived without announcement on a Wednesday afternoon on a dark bay horse wearing the same plain coat he'd had at the courthouse. He found Elizabeth at the south fence line arguing in measured but unmistakable terms with the fence contractor about the depth of the post setting, and he waited at a respectful distance until the contractor, looking somewhat chastened, had agreed to redo the south corner and left. Then William walked his horse up to where she was standing and said, "He'll do it right this time." "He'd better," Elizabeth said without turning around. Then she did turn around, and there was a half-second of adjustment. She hadn't known he was coming, and she was not at her most collected, dusty from the fence line with her hair escaping its pins, and then she settled and said, "Mr. Ashford, I didn't know you were expected." "I wasn't," he said. "I was passing through, and I thought I'd see how the Garfield land was getting on." "The Harrington land," she said very quietly, but with absolute precision. He looked at her for a moment, and then something at the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but near enough. "The Harrington land," he agreed. He stepped down from his horse and walked the south fence line with her, asking occasional questions that were neither condescending nor performative. He was genuinely interested. She realized, genuinely curious about her plans for the rotation schedule, about whether she'd spoken to the miller upstream, about the water share, about what she was thinking for the spring planting. He listened when she answered. That was the thing that struck her. He actually listened, not with the patient, slightly distracted courtesy of a man waiting for the woman to finish speaking so he could explain why she was wrong, but with real attention, the kind that meant he was actually processing what she said, and sometimes changing his own view based on it. It was such a simple thing. It shouldn't have felt remarkable. It did. "You've done a great deal in 6 weeks, he said when they had completed the circuit of the south field and stood for a moment at the property's edge, looking back over the land. "There was a great deal to do," she said. "Most people would have taken a month just to sort out the fencing contract. I don't have the patience for that kind of slowness." "No," he said, and there was something in his tone, thoughtful, not unkind, that made her glance at him. "I reckon you don't." There was a comfortable silence which surprised her, because silences with people she didn't know well were rarely comfortable. She was usually busy in them, managing them, filling them, making sure they didn't become awkward. This one simply was the way the afternoon light simply was, without requiring anything of her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "What brought you to Lexington?" She looked at the land. "A stagecoach," she said. He waited. She was quiet for a moment, feeling the question, feeling the shape of the answer. She had not told anyone in Lexington, not the lawyer, not the Prentice brothers, not even the grain merchant Dulles, what had brought her from Virginia. It was her business, and nobody else's. and she was done. She had decided with explaining herself to people who had not earned the explanation. But something about the quality of William Ashford's silence, the same patient, genuine quality as his listening, made the words come differently than she expected. "I was made a fool of," she said, "by someone who thought I would accept it quietly because I always had before." "Did you," he said, "accept it?" "No," she said. "I left." He nodded once slowly. "That took courage. It took anger," she said. "Courage would have been staying and fighting. I wasn't ready for that. I needed to go somewhere I could build something that was mine before I could think about fighting for anything." She hadn't intended to say that much. She looked at him, checking, waiting for the expression of men who were made uncomfortable by women who said direct things, the particular social flinch that usually followed. It didn't come. "That seems wise," William said simply. She turned back to look at the land. "The Miller wheat strain," she said, returning them deliberately to safer ground. "Have you used it? I'm considering it for the South Field." He took the redirect without comment. "Once. 2 seasons back. It holds well in wet summers, but you'll want to watch the drainage on your lower corner." I was thinking the same. They talked about wheat for 10 more minutes, and when he left, swinging easily back into the saddle, giving her that same short, respectful nod he'd offered at the courthouse. Elizabeth stood and watched the horse and rider move down the road, and felt something shift inside her, very slowly, like ice in late February. She did not name it. She went back to the fence line. The letter from Caroline arrived in September. Elizabeth was at the kitchen table with Frances going over the harvest calculations when the post came. She recognized her sister's handwriting on the envelope, the same round pretty loops she'd had since girlhood, and she set it to one side and finished the calculation she was working on before she opened it. Frances watched her do this and said nothing. The letter was 3 pages. It began with pleasantries. The weather in Virginia, the garden at the Crawford estate, the social calendar of the fall season. It moved into domestic detail, the redecorating of the front parlor, a new cook, a luncheon Nathaniel had hosted for the county commissioners. Then, on the 3rd page, it said, "I know things between us are not as they ought to be, Lizzie, and I want you to know that I think about that. I know what Nathaniel and I did hurt you, and I am sorry for the hurt, truly I am. But I need you to understand that I did not plan it. It simply happened the way things do, and by the time I understood what was happening, it was already done. I hope in time you will come to see it that way too. I hope we can be sisters again." Elizabeth read it twice. Then she folded it and set it on the table. "Anything I need to know about?" Frances asked, looking at the harvest figures. "No," Elizabeth said. She picked up her pen and went back to the calculation. That night in her room, she took the letter out and read it a 3rd time. She sat with it in her lap for a long time in the dark, listening to the insects outside and the sound of the house settling. I did not plan it. It simply happened. She thought about 6 weeks of Tuesday mornings and Thursday afternoons. She thought about the study and the maps and the candle burning low. She thought about Nathaniel's face in the parlor of the Crawford house, looking at her with perfect polished blankness. She thought about her mother in the kitchen garden saying, "Your sister has always been the one who," and she thought about what it meant that Caroline's apology did not once mention the lie. The specific, deliberate, sustained lie of a man pretending not to know her. The silence of a family that watched it happen and said nothing. The wedding she had been expected to attend, had been expected to smile through, had been expected to absorb into herself, like water into soil, so that the surface would look smooth and undisturbed for everyone else's comfort. I am sorry for the hurt. Not I am sorry for what I did. Not I am sorry for what we let happen to you. Not I am sorry I did not stop it when I could. Just the hurt. As though the hurt had arrived from nowhere, a weather event, an act of God, something no one had caused, and therefore no one needed to account for. Elizabeth folded the letter again. She did not write back. Tia. William Ashford came by the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and then the one after that, until it became quietly and without announcement a standing Thursday afternoon fact of Elizabeth's week in Lexington. He never stayed long. He was always doing something nearby. He had his own business in the county land management of his own connections with the mill and the grain merchant and the local bankers that were substantial without being showy. And he had the manner of a man who stopped by because he was genuinely in the neighborhood, and not because he had arranged himself to be. She didn't examine this too closely. She was not ready to examine it, but she noticed, and she stopped pretending she didn't. He brought her information about a merchant in town who had cheated the Prentice family 3 years back and with whom she should therefore not do business. About a county road project that might affect her northern fence line. About a man named Patterson who was looking to sell 40 acres adjoining her eastern border and who might be open to a fair offer. She brought him problems. A contract clause. She couldn't parse a dispute with a neighboring farmer over a shared water source. A question about the mill's pricing structure that smelled wrong to her, and which turned out when William looked into it to be exactly as wrong as she had thought. "How did you know?" he asked the afternoon she'd handed him the mill receipts with 3 numbers circled. "The pattern was off," she said. "The same way crop rotation goes wrong, you can feel it before you can explain it." He looked at the circled numbers. Then he looked at her. "You'd have made a formidable lawyer." "Women can't be lawyers." "That's the law's loss," he said with a directness that was not flattery but simply assessment, and Elizabeth looked away before her expression could do something she'd regret. Don't. The news from Virginia came in October through the kind of circuitous social route that meant everyone heard it at approximately the same time. Nathaniel Crawford's Western holdings had suffered a catastrophic crop failure. The tobacco, which made up the bulk of his revenue, had come in at less than a third of the expected yield. The debt his father had left, which Elizabeth alone had known about, and which she had quietly helped manage through 2 profitable seasons of careful guidance, was no longer manageable. He was not ruined. Not yet. But he was in trouble. Aunt Frances set the letter from her Richmond acquaintance on the supper table with the same expression she'd set the land auction notice 3 months ago, simply without comment, and waited. Elizabeth read it. "He dismissed the estate manager last spring," she said. "I heard." "You heard correctly," Frances said, "and hired someone who cost half as much and knew a quarter as much." "Also correct." Elizabeth set the letter down. "What does he need?" she said, because she couldn't help it, because understanding the shape of a problem was as automatic to her as breathing. "He needs a profitable spring," Frances said, "which he won't have if he doesn't restructure the Western holdings before winter." Elizabeth was quiet. She thought about Nathaniel Crawford standing in his parlor looking at her with courteous blankness. She thought about the wedding. She thought about the road out of Virginia, with the heat pressing down and the sound of church bells fading behind her. Then she thought about her 40 acres with the spring-fed corner and the south field ready for winter wheat. She thought about the name signed on the deed of sale, Harrington. "He made his bed," she said finally. "He did," Frances agreed. "And I am not his estate manager anymore." "No, you're not." Elizabeth rose from the table and went to the window. Outside, the October dark was coming in fast, and the first real chill of the season was in the air, and she could smell the harvest smell of dry corn and turned earth, and the particular autumnal sharpness that meant summer was truly over. She had spent the summer building something. She had built it fast, and she had built it well, and she had built it entirely on her own terms, and for the first time in 26 years of her life, when she stood in that house at night and looked at what she had done, she did not feel the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent all day being useful to other people. She felt the different, cleaner tiredness of a woman who had spent the day being useful to herself. "Let him figure it out," she said quietly. Frances behind her said, "Good." The Patterson land came through in November. It was the 40 acres to her east that William had mentioned back in the summer. And when Patterson finally came to the point of being willing to sell, Elizabeth made her offer and stood behind it without flinching and got the land at a price that was fair to both of them. because she had prepared for the negotiation the way she prepared for everything thoroughly, without drama, with all the relevant facts arranged in her mind, before she walked in. She signed the second deed on a gray November morning with Caleb and Jonas Prentice as witnesses, and when she walked out of the lawyer's office with the paper in her hand, she stopped on the courthouse steps and looked at the Kentucky sky and felt something that she eventually identified as satisfaction. Not triumph, satisfaction. The quiet, solid satisfaction of a thing done well. 80 acres, said Jonas, who was standing behind her on the steps. Not bad for one summer, Miss Harrington. Not bad at all, Caleb agreed. Elizabeth looked at the paper one more time. Then she folded it into her reticule and said, "The north fence needs looking at before the frost. Let's get back." She was in town the following week when she heard Caroline's name spoken aloud for the first time since she'd left Virginia. She was at the dry goods counter waiting for her order when two women she recognized, the wife of a county official and her companion, came in behind her and began talking with the comfortable unself-consciousness of people who had not noticed the other occupant of the room. "I heard the Crawford woman is expecting," the first one said. "Which Crawford woman?" the second said. "The new one, the young one, the pretty one." A pause. "The husband's been spending a great deal of time in Richmond on business, they say, since the harvest losses. Financial trouble, significant from what I hear. He had a very capable manager handling the estates for years and apparently let her go." The first woman lowered her voice in the manner of someone who was not actually lowering their voice very much. Her, can you imagine? A woman managing those holdings. No wonder he thought he could do without. I imagine he couldn't quite accept the arrangement. But now they say. Elizabeth set her coin on the counter, picked up her package, and walked out of the shop before the sentence finished. She stood on the street for a moment in the November cold and breathed. Caroline was expecting, of course. Life moved forward, even the lives of people who had done the things that Caroline and Nathaniel had done. The world did not stop and wait for justice to arrange itself. Children were born debts, mounted harvests failed, and the people who had made the worst choices simply lived with the consequences of those choices at a pace that the rest of the world rarely found satisfying. She thought about the baby. She thought with a painful clarity she had not expected about a child who had not asked to be born into a family built on a lie. Then she thought about the fact that that was not her responsibility. She walked back to her horse and rode home through the November cold. And that evening she wrote a letter not to Caroline, not to her father, not to Nathaniel, but to the bank in Lexington about the terms of a loan for a third parcel of land she'd had her eye on since August. She was done looking back. William Ashford kissed her for the first time on a Thursday evening in early December. It was not planned. Nothing between them had ever quite been planned. It had accumulated the way good things sometimes do in small increments, each one so reasonable in isolation that you could not quite point to the moment when it had become something more. They had been in Francis's parlor going over some papers related to a shared water rights question that affected both his holdings and hers. And at some point, the papers had been set aside, and they had been talking about something else entirely. She could not afterward remember what, and there had been one of those comfortable silences. And then it hadn't been silent. He pulled back first and looked at her very seriously, the way he looked at everything with that gray, steady attention that gave nothing away except that he was paying full attention. "I should say," he said, "that I'm not a man who does things halfway." "I've noticed," Elizabeth said. Her voice was steady. She was not going to be undone by a kiss in a parlor, not at 26 with 80 acres and a winter wheat crop coming in and a bank loan already approved. "I want to say it clearly," he said, "because I reckon you've had enough of things that were unclear." She looked at him. "I am not interested in what you can manage for me," he said. "I am not interested in your land or your connections or your capability, though I respect all of them. I am interested in you." He paused. "I want that to be plain." She was very quiet for a moment. She thought about the study in Virginia. She thought about Tuesday mornings and the way Nathaniel had said, "You are the only woman I could ever choose," with the tone of a man stating a fact, before she had understood that some men stated facts the way other men made promises contingently temporarily with terms not disclosed. She thought about the day she had set the ring on the table. "For the first time in my life, I choose myself." She looked at William Ashford, who was watching her with that patient, genuine attention of his, not rushing her, not filling the silence, simply waiting. Offering, not requiring. "I want it plain too," she said. "I am not the same woman I was when I left Virginia. I have no intention of becoming the person I was before. I will not be managed, set aside, or traded away. Not for anything." "Good," he said quietly. "I'm serious, William." "Elizabeth," he said, "so am I." She believed him. This time, the believing felt different. Not the believing of a woman who was desperate to believe, but the believing of a woman who had spent 6 months rebuilding herself from the ground up and had learned in the process to know the difference between words that were real and words that were performance. These were real. "All right then," she said. Outside, the December cold pressed against the windows, and the fire burned low, and somewhere across the Kentucky hills, Nathaniel Crawford was spending the winter managing the wreckage of a harvest. His father's debts could not survive in a house with a woman who loved his position and a lie that had cost him the one person who might have known how to help him hold it all together. Elizabeth Harrington did not think about any of that. She was thinking about spring planting. She was thinking about the third parcel of land. She was thinking about the man sitting across from her, who had asked the very first time they'd spoken, not what she could be for other people, but what she wanted to become. She was building something, and it was only just beginning. The winter wheat came in strong. Elizabeth knew it would. She had spent 2 months preparing that soil with the kind of focused, methodical care that left very little room for failure. And when the first green shoots pushed through the frost-hardened ground in early March, she stood at the edge of the south field with her arms crossed, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt since she was a child, the uncomplicated satisfaction of a thing working out the way you'd planned it. Caleb Prentice came to stand beside her. "Southfield's going to give us a good yield," he said. "I know," Elizabeth said. "How do you know it's barely showing?" "Look at the spacing," she said. "Look at the color. That's a healthy crop, Caleb. That's what healthy looks like when it's young." He looked, then he looked at her. "You always know, don't you, Miss Harrington?" "Not always," she said, and turned back toward the house. "But about land usually." What she didn't say, what she kept quiet and private in the part of herself she had learned to protect, was that the wheat was not the only thing she was watching carefully that spring. She was watching William, too, in the way a woman watches something she is not yet ready to name. Cataloging the small and consistent things, the way he showed up when he said he would. The way he disagreed with her sometimes, without turning it into a contest, the way he'd gone out of his way in February to stop a business deal that would have benefited him, but hurt a farming family on his eastern border. She was watching, and what she saw held up under scrutiny. That was new. In her experience, things that appeared solid rarely survived close examination. But William Ashford, the longer she looked, only seemed more of what he'd appeared to be at the courthouse that summer morning. Plain-spoken, steady, genuinely decent. She distrusted the observation because she had been wrong before. She trusted the evidence because she had learned how to read it. The letter from her father arrived in March, and it was the kind of letter that had been drafted and redrafted several times before being sent. She could tell by the uncharacteristic hesitation in the language, the places where the pen had paused and the ink had spread slightly, while Thomas Harrington sat at his desk and tried to find words for things he had spent his entire life not saying. He asked how she was. He mentioned the spring planting. He noted with visible effort that he had heard she had acquired a second parcel of land in Lexington County. Then he said, "I want you to know, Elizabeth, that your mother and I miss you. The house is not quite, it is different without you here. There are matters pertaining to the estate that I find I am not managing as smoothly as I had anticipated. I wonder whether you might consider a visit, Elizabeth sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about what it meant that her father had waited 8 months to write this. She thought about what it meant that the first acknowledgement of her absence was attached to a difficulty he was having managing without her. She thought about the kitchen garden and the study and all those Tuesday mornings when she had run an estate that bore someone else's name. She thought about what Francis had said the day she arrived. "I've been expecting you to leave that house for 5 years," she wrote back. She told him she was well. She told him the land was prospering. She told him she was glad to hear from him. And then, with the careful precision of a woman who had spent the winter learning to say exactly what she meant, she said, "I will not be returning to Virginia. Papa, not to live. This is my home now, but if you would like to visit, you are welcome here. I would be glad to see you." She did not mention the estate management. She did not offer to help with the accounts. She sent it on a Tuesday, which might have been accidental and might not have been, and went back to work. William proposed on a Thursday in April. He did it without theater, which was consistent with everything else about him. They were walking the boundary of the third parcel, the one whose bank loan had been approved in December, and which she was now in the process of bringing into production. And he had been quiet for a while, in a way that was slightly different from his usual quiet, and Elizabeth, who had become very attuned to the particular qualities of his silences, had been aware of it, without saying anything. Then he stopped walking. She stopped too, and turned to look at him. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the north drainage." "No," he said, "about you." She waited. "I've been thinking," he said again slower, "that I would like to spend the rest of my life having Thursday afternoons like this one." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. Her heart had done something she preferred not to examine too closely, but her face, she was proud to note, remained composed. "That's a very practical way to propose," she said. "I'm a practical man." "I've noticed." Elizabeth. He said her name in the way he sometimes did, plainly, without decoration, as though her name itself was enough of a complete thought. "I am asking you to marry me. Not because it makes sense on paper, not because it would benefit either of our holdings, though it would. Because I want to." He paused. "Because you are the finest person I have met in 40 years of living, and I would like to keep knowing you for the next 40. She was quiet. The April wind moved through the new grass of the third parcel, and she could smell the turned earth and the particular freshness of a Kentucky spring. And she stood there and felt with a clarity that was almost physical the exact shape of the choice in front of her. She thought about what she'd said to him in December. "I will not be managed, set aside, or traded away. Not for anything." And she thought about what he'd said. "Good. I need to say something," she said. "Say it." "I am not marrying you to be taken care of," she said. "I don't need taking care of. I have 120 acres and a winter wheat crop and 2 farmhands who have finally stopped looking surprised when I tell them what to do. I know. And I will not be made to feel that what I've built here is secondary. To your holdings, to your name, to anyone's opinion of what a wife ought to look like." "Elizabeth," he said, "I am asking you to marry me, not to manage my land, not to run my household, not to be decorative or secondary or set aside." He looked at her without flinching. "I am asking because I respect you, and I like you, and I love you, and those 3 things in my experience don't arrive together very often." She felt something give way inside her. Not a collapse, not the way things had given way the morning of the wedding in Virginia, that terrible liquid dissolution of a thing she'd been holding together by sheer will. This was different. This was more like the way a door opens simply on well-oiled hinges, because someone has knocked and waited, and the person inside has chosen to open it. "Yes," she said, "just that. No qualification. No conditions, no protective hedging, just the single clean word offered to the only person in her life who had ever made her feel that a simple yes was enough." William Ashford looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He exhaled slow and audible, the breath of a man who had been holding something carefully for quite some time. "Good," he said. She almost laughed. "That's all you have to say." "What else is there?" he said. "You said yes. Everything I needed to know is in that." She looked away across the third parcel, across the spring-green landscape of everything she had built since August, and she felt the words settling into her like seed into good soil, permanent-rooted already beginning to grow. The news reached Lexington by May, the way news always reached Lexington, through letters and visiting merchants and the particular efficiency of women who paid attention. Nathaniel Crawford was selling. Not everything. Not the main estate, not the house itself. But the Western holdings, the 2 large parcels that made up nearly a third of his productive land, were going on the market, and the price he was asking made it plain that he needed the sale to happen quickly. Elizabeth heard it from Frances, who had heard it from her Richmond acquaintance, who had heard it from someone inside the Crawford household's extended social circle. Frances set the information on the breakfast table with a precision that had become familiar. Elizabeth read the letter. Then she set it down and picked up her coffee. "He's been losing ground since last fall," she said. "I'm not surprised." "The question," Frances said, watching her, "is whether you are interested." Elizabeth looked up. "The Western parcels," Frances said. "They're good land. You know that. You mapped them yourself 3 years ago." She had. She had spent a summer afternoon in 1810, walking those fields with Nathaniel, explaining to him quietly, systematically, the way she explained everything, exactly what they were worth, and why, and what rotation schedule would keep them producing at the highest yield, and what water management the southern corner needed. He had listened and nodded, and done exactly what she recommended. Now he was selling them. "I'm not in a position to purchase something that size," Elizabeth said. "You and William together might be." Elizabeth was quiet. She thought about what it would mean practically, financially, strategically to purchase land from Nathaniel Crawford. She thought about the numbers because the numbers were what they were, and they didn't carry the weight of everything else. She thought about the fact that good land was good land, regardless of who had owned it before. Then she thought about everything else. "No," she said. Frances waited. "Not because I couldn't separate the business from the history," Elizabeth said. "I could, but because there will be other land, and I will not spend a single minute of my life negotiating with that man, even across a lawyer's table." She paused. "I am done with anything that requires me to sit in the same room as Nathaniel Crawford." Frances nodded slowly. "All right." "Someone else will buy it," Elizabeth said. "The price is low enough. Someone will see the value." She was right. The Western parcels sold within the month to a family from the Shenandoah Valley who had no connection to anyone in the story, and who were simply in the right position at the right time. Nathaniel Crawford used the sale to retire the most pressing portion of his debt. It was not enough. Elizabeth learned this not because she was watching him, she wasn't, but because the news simply arrived the way news did, and she heard it and filed it away, and went back to the thing she was doing, which was reviewing the contract for the grain sale, and which was considerably more interesting. She and William married in June. It was a small ceremony, Francis the Prentice brothers, William's foreman, and his wife, the lawyer Pratt, who had drawn up both of Elizabeth's land deeds and who had long since stopped looking surprised by anything she did, and a minister who came from the Methodist church in town. Elizabeth wore a dress the color of cream cotton, simple and well-made, without Brussels lace or silk ribbons, or any of the ornamentation that had been on Caroline's wedding dress. She had chosen it herself at the dry goods store, and the woman behind the counter had asked if she'd like to look at the dress fabrics in the back, the fancier ones, and Elizabeth had looked at the cream cotton and said, "This is exactly what I want." She meant the dress. She also meant everything the dress represented. The ceremony was in the morning, before the summer heat peaked in Francis's front parlor, with all the windows open. The minister's voice was clear and unhurried. William stood beside her without fidgeting, without performance, without any of the elaborate composure of a man managing an impression. He was simply there the way he was always simply there, present, steady, completely himself. When the minister asked if she took William Ashford as her husband, Elizabeth said yes, the same way she'd said yes in April, without qualification, without protection, without the careful hedging of a woman who had been burned and was managing the scar tissue. Just yes. Afterward, Frances hugged her, which was not a thing Frances did often, and said in her ear very quietly, "Your grandmother would have liked you very much." Elizabeth pulled back and looked at her. She was the same, Frances said simply. She knew what she was worth before anyone told her. Elizabeth held that thought close for the rest of the day. The summer of 1813 was the summer she stopped being a woman who was known for what had happened to her and started being a woman who was known for what she had done. It happened gradually, and then all at once. The grain merchant Dulles, who had spent an uncomfortable 45 minutes the previous summer learning what it meant to negotiate with Elizabeth Harrington, had apparently told the story as people told stories about the encounters that had unsettled them to enough other merchants that her reputation had preceded her to the county seat before she'd ever set foot there. When she attended the Autumn Land Commissioners' meeting in August with William, there were 3 men who already knew her name. Not Ashford's wife, Harrington, her own name. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. The Prentice brothers had expanded her farming operation with the quiet efficiency of men who had long since made their peace with taking direction from a woman. And Caleb had started calling her Miss Elizabeth, with a respect that was entirely genuine. And Jonas had brought his younger brother on to help with the fall harvest, without being asked because he'd understood correctly that they were going to need the extra hands. Her 3 parcels together now ran 140 acres. It was not the largest holding in the county. It was not even close to the Crawford holdings in Virginia, which she tried not to think about and mostly succeeded. But it was hers, every acre signed in her name, every crop planted by her plan, every negotiation completed by her hand, and it was prospering. In September, a woman named Mrs. Gallagher came to her door. She was the wife of one of the smaller farmers south of town. A woman in her 40s with the worn, practical face of someone who had been doing heavy work for a long time and expected to keep doing it. She came without announcement on a Thursday morning and waited on the porch until Elizabeth came out. "Mrs. Gallagher," Elizabeth said, "what can I do for you?" "I heard," Mrs. Gallagher said, "that you helped the Henderson family with their water rights dispute in the spring." "I advised them," Elizabeth said, "on the legal language in the contract. I'm not a lawyer." "No," Mrs. Gallagher said, "but you knew what the language meant, and now they've got their water. And my husband's got a similar problem with the Reese family on our north border, and we can't afford a lawyer, and—" She stopped. Her jaw was tight. Her hands were clasped in front of her with a controlled firmness that Elizabeth recognized. "I was told you might be willing to look at it." Elizabeth looked at her for a moment. "Come in," she said. "I'll put on coffee." Mrs. Gallagher came in, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Elizabeth read through the contract documents with the careful, unhurried attention she gave to everything, and within an hour she had identified the specific clause that was being misapplied and explained to Mrs. Gallagher in plain language exactly what it meant and what recourse the Gallaghers had. When Mrs. Gallagher left, she shook Elizabeth's hand with both of hers, and her eyes were bright. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't need to," Elizabeth said. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," Elizabeth said. "I wanted to." And she meant it. She genuinely meant it. And the thing that struck her, standing on the porch watching Mrs. Gallagher walk back down the road, was how different it felt to give help freely because she chose to, versus giving it because it had been required of her. The action looked the same from the outside. Inside, it was entirely different. She went back to the kitchen and wrote down what she remembered of the Gallagher contract clauses in case there were other families with similar disputes, which she suspected there would be. There were. What? The twist arrived in October in a form she had not anticipated. William came home from a business trip to Frankfurt on a Tuesday evening, which was not his usual day, and he came in with an expression she had learned to read as the expression of a man carrying information he wasn't sure how to deliver. She set down what she was reading. "What is it?" she said. He sat down across from her. He put his hat on the table. He looked at her directly. He always looked at her directly, which was one of the things she had come to depend on. "I ran into a man in Frankfurt," he said. a merchant from Richmond. He recognized my name, apparently something to do with grain prices, and we had dinner together. All right, Elizabeth said. He knew the Crawford family, William said. He had business with them last year. Elizabeth's hands, which had been resting on the table, didn't move. What did he say? He said Caroline Crawford lost the baby, William said quietly. In August, a boy. She was very still. She had not let herself think about the baby since November, when she'd stood on the street in the cold and decided it was not her responsibility. She had kept that decision, had held it steady through the winter and the spring and the summer, and now the information arrived regardless the way things did, and hit her somewhere she had not quite finished protecting. She's all right, Elizabeth said. Her voice was even. She was working to keep it even. Apparently, William said. Physically. But the man said the household has been difficult. Crawford's financial situation has gotten worse. And... He paused. He said Caroline asked about you. Elizabeth looked up. She asked if anyone knew where you were, William said. The merchant didn't know you were here, obviously. He didn't tell her anything, but he thought I should know. Elizabeth sat with this. She thought about Caroline at 22, with her gold hair and her easy laugh, and the way she had walked into the parlor that afternoon and changed everything without trying. She thought about the letter in September. I did not plan it. It simply happened, and the way Caroline had never once in all the months of silence since actually said the word wrong. Had never said what we did to you was wrong. She thought about a baby boy in August. She thought about her sister in a house with a man who had built their life together on a lie with debts they couldn't pay, and now this grief on top of everything else. She thought about the word sister, and what it had meant, and what it meant now, and whether those two things were the same. William, she said. Yes. I'm not going back. I know. I'm not going to rescue her from the situation she helped create. I know that too. But I'm going to write to her, Elizabeth said. Not to forgive everything at once, I don't think I can do that yet. But to tell her I know about the baby. She paused. Because whatever she did to me, she's still my sister. And losing a child is a grief that doesn't care what else is happening. William looked at her for a long moment. That's a generous thing, he said. It's a human thing, Elizabeth said. There's a difference. She wrote the letter that night at the kitchen table in the lamplight. It was short, 2 paragraphs, and it said exactly what she'd told William she would say. She was sorry about the loss. She was well. She hoped Caroline was recovering. She did not say she forgave her. She did not say she understood. But she sent it. And when she sealed the envelope, she felt something loosen slightly. Not in the place where the hurt was, which was still there, and would be for a long time, she knew, but somewhere adjacent to it. The place where she kept the things she hadn't been able to set down. It didn't go away, but it shifted. November brought the news she had been half expecting and half dreading since October. Nathaniel Crawford was coming to Kentucky, not to see her. She knew that immediately. The instinct for these things had sharpened over the past year and a half into something reliable. He wasn't coming for her. He was coming on business. There was a land consortium forming in Frankfort, and several large Virginia landholders had been invited to participate, and Nathaniel Crawford, despite his financial difficulties, still had enough of a name and enough of a remaining holding to make him a relevant figure at that table. He would be in Lexington for 2 days on his way through. Frances told her over breakfast with the same plain directness she used for everything. He'll be at the Beaumont Hotel on the 14th and 15th. I thought you should know. Elizabeth set down her cup. Who told you? Mrs. Pratt, Frances said. Whose husband drew up your land deeds, as you'll recall. Of course. Elizabeth thought for a moment. He won't come here. No, Frances agreed. He doesn't know you're here, I'd wager. The Pratts are discreet people. He'll find out I'm here, Elizabeth said. Lexington isn't Richmond. People talk. They do, Frances said. The question is whether you want to manage that or simply let it happen. Elizabeth looked in the kitchen wall at the calendar with the harvest dates marked and the seed rotation written out in her neat hand at all the visible evidence of a life she had built stitch by careful stitch since August of last year. "Let it happen," she said. "I won't hide from him, but I won't seek him out either. If we cross paths, we cross paths." "And if he seeks you out?" Frances said. Elizabeth picked up her cup again. "Then I'll handle it." She said it the way she said everything now, not with the brittle composure of a woman holding herself together, but with the steadiness of a woman who knew precisely and completely where she stood. Frances nodded once. "That's my girl," she said. Elizabeth almost smiled. She did not avoid the 14th of November. She had business in town. She always had business in town, and she went about it in exactly the way she would have gone about it on any other day. Efficiently, without ceremony, moving from the grain merchant to the lawyer's office to the dry goods counter, with the purposeful ease of a woman for whom the town was her working landscape. She did not see Nathaniel on the 14th. She saw him on the 15th. She was coming out of the lawyer's office with a contract revision in her hand when she nearly walked into him at the bottom of the steps. She stopped. He stopped. And for a fraction of a second, the world contracted to the two of them on those courthouse steps. The November cold between them, the contract in her hand, the distance that was both larger and smaller than 2 years. He looked different, not worse exactly. He was still well-dressed, still composed, still the man who had been trained since birth to present well in public. But there was something around the edges of him that hadn't been there before. A tightening. The particular look of a man who had been managing something difficult for a sustained period. She recognized it. She'd seen it in the mirror her whole life. "Miss Harrington," he said. "Mrs. Ashford," she said. Quietly, without heat. Just the fact. Something moved across his face so quickly she almost missed it. Almost. I didn't know you were in Lexington." "I've been here since the summer before last," she said. "I own land here." "I heard. I didn't know." He stopped. She waited with the patience of a woman who had nothing to prove. "Elizabeth," he said. Just her name in the way he'd never quite allowed himself to say it the last time they'd spoken in his parlor, with the perfect composure of a man pretending not to know her. "Mr. Crawford," she said. "I hope your business in Frankfurt goes well." She stepped around him and walked down the street and did not look back. It was the right thing to do. She knew it was the right thing to do, and she did it cleanly without hesitation, the way she did everything now. And she kept walking until she turned the corner and was out of his sight line, and then she stopped and stood for a moment with her back against the wall of the dry goods store, and breathed. In. Out. The contract was still in her hand. She looked down at it. Her name on the document. Her land. Her work. Her life built from the ground up on the other side of the worst morning she had ever lived through. She breathed in again. Then she pushed off the wall and walked home. That evening, when William came in and found her at the table reviewing the contract, he looked at her once in the way he had of reading her accurately, without requiring her to perform any particular feeling. "You're all right," he said. "Not a question." "I am," she said. "Good." He sat down and reached for the contract. "What does Pratt say about the northern boundary language?" she told him. They worked until the fire burned low and the November dark settled around the house, and somewhere across the Kentucky hills, Nathaniel Crawford packed his bags for Frankfurt, and the world moved on, the way it always did without asking anyone's permission, carrying all of them forward into whatever came next. But Elizabeth Harrington, Elizabeth Ashford now on paper, though she kept both names because both were hers, and she would not surrender either, she was not being carried. She was walking. That was the difference. And it was everything. The winter of 1813 was the coldest Kentucky had seen in a decade, and Elizabeth spent it the way she spent everything now working. She was not running from anything. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself, in the private accounting she kept in the part of her mind that didn't require an audience. She was not working to fill silence, not working to avoid thinking not working, because she was afraid of what stillness might bring up. She was working because she had 140 acres and 3 farmhands and a grain contract to honor, and a husband who had his own holdings to manage. And there was simply always more to do than there were hours in the day. That was different from before. Before, the busyness had been a kind of armor. Now it was just life. Her life. The one she had chosen and built, and was continuing to build, and it fit her the way good work always fits the person who is suited to it, without chafing, without the constant low-grade exhaustion of doing something that doesn't quite belong to you. She was happy. She took stock of that fact with the same careful honesty she applied to everything else, turned it over, examined it from multiple angles, and found it to be true. She was genuinely, specifically, concretely happy. She had not expected that. Not so soon. She had expected recovery, the slow, gradual process of rebuilding, but she had not expected to arrive somewhere that felt not just like recovery, but like arrival. Like she had finally reached a place she was meant to be. It unsettled her mildly in the way that good things sometimes unsettled her. She distrusted ease on instinct. She had been taught without words by 26 years of being the useful one, the capable one, the one who made things work, that comfort was always provisional, that it could be required of you at any moment. William noticed. He noticed most things about her which she was still getting used to. "You're waiting for something to go wrong," he said one evening in January, not looking up from the ledger he was reviewing. She looked at him. "I beg your pardon. You've been happy for 3 months, he said. "I can tell because you keep checking." "I do not check." "You do," he said perfectly pleasantly. "You get a particular look, like you're taking inventory." She was quiet for a moment. "Old habit," she said finally. "I know." He turned a page of the ledger. "Nothing's going to be taken from you, Elizabeth." She looked at him across the table. At the top of his head bent over the ledger. At the simple, domestic, absolutely solid reality of him sitting in her kitchen on a January evening, as though this was the most ordinary thing in the world, which was the entire point. "You can't promise that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I can promise that if something goes wrong, you'll handle it. You always do." He glanced up. "You're the most capable person I've ever met. You just forget to count yourself sometimes." She didn't answer that. She picked up her own paperwork and went back to it. But she held the words somewhere close. The letter from Caroline came in February. Not a social letter this time. Not 3 pages of pleasantries moving towards something difficult on the 3rd page. This was 4 lines in her sister's handwriting, but different from before the loops. Less practiced, the lines slightly uneven. The handwriting of someone who had written this in a state that didn't allow for careful presentation. Lizzie. "I need to talk to you, not by letter. I need you to come, or I need to come to you. I know I have no right to ask this. I know what I did. I am not asking you to forget it. I am asking you to let me say it to your face, because I have been trying to live with what I know, and I cannot anymore. Please." Elizabeth read it 3 times. Then she set it on the table in the same spot where every significant piece of correspondence had landed for the past year and a half, Frances's kitchen table, which had witnessed more of her life than any piece of furniture had a right to, and she sat down and pressed her hands flat against the wood and breathed. William was in the barn. Frances was in the front room. Elizabeth was alone with the letter and what it meant. She thought about, "I know what I did." 3 words she had been waiting without admitting she was waiting for 18 months. Not, "I'm sorry for the hurt." Not, "It simply happened." But "I know what I did." It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. Those 3 words didn't undo anything. Didn't reach back into the summer of 1812 and change what had been chosen and what had been sacrificed and what had been lost. They didn't give back the Tuesday mornings. They didn't change the church steps, or her father's face, or the sound of wedding bells 2 miles down a road she was already walking away from. But they were real. In a way the first letter hadn't been. She went to the front room and stood in the doorway until Frances looked up. "Caroline wants to come here," Elizabeth said. Frances set down her needlework. She looked at Elizabeth for a long moment. "What do you want?" she said, just as she had asked it in the summer of 1812, the day Elizabeth had arrived with her traveling case and her very straight spine. "I want to know what she has to say," Elizabeth said, face to face. "That's different from forgiving her. I know, I'm not saying I'm ready for that." She paused. "But I think I need to hear it. Whatever it is she's been carrying." She looked at her aunt. "Am I wrong?" Frances picked up her needlework again. "You're not wrong," she said. "You're human, which is allowed." Elizabeth wrote back that evening. She said Caroline could come in March when the worst of the winter travel was over. She said she would have the guest room ready. She said nothing about what she expected or what she was willing to offer. Just come in March. She sealed it and sent it before she could change her mind. William, when she told him, was quiet for a moment. That was exactly the right length. "How do you feel about it?" he said. "Complicated," she said. "Do you want me here, or would you rather I was somewhere else for that conversation?" She looked at him. "Here," she said. "Not in the room, but here." "All right," he said simply. That was all. No analysis. No opinion on whether she was making the right choice. No gentle steering toward or away from the decision she'd already made. Just all right. She had not known before William how much weight was in those two words when they were spoken by someone who actually meant them. February brought something she hadn't anticipated: the schoolroom. It had started with Mrs. Gallagher's water rights, had grown through a half-dozen similar conversations at her kitchen table through the fall, and had arrived in February at something she hadn't planned, but which in retrospect seemed inevitable. There were 8 children in the southern part of Lexington County who had no access to formal schooling. Their families were farmers, most of them people who had land and work, and the particular proud dignity of people who had carved something out of difficult circumstances, but not money for tutors and not proximity to the county school in town. Elizabeth found out about them through Jonas Prentice, whose youngest sister was one of the 8. Hannah reads, Jonas told her on a February morning when they were reviewing the seed inventory. Real well, actually. She taught herself from a Bible, but there's nowhere for her to go from there. Elizabeth looked at him. How old is she? 9. Bring her Saturday morning, Elizabeth said, and the others if their families are willing. Jonas blinked. What for? Because I taught myself surveying from my father's land maps at age 11, Elizabeth said, and it would have been considerably faster if someone had helped me. She picked up the seed inventory again. Saturday morning. I'll have the kitchen table clear. Jonas opened his mouth, closed it, said, Yes, ma'am, and went back to work. She started with 8 children. By March, she had 12. She held class on Saturday mornings at the kitchen table, using what she had: a Bible, 2 arithmetic texts she'd had shipped from a bookseller in Frankfurt, her own notes on land management and accounting that she adapted into lessons with the same methodical care she brought to everything. She was not a trained teacher. She knew that. She improvised, constantly adjusted, threw out what didn't work and kept what did. The children were a revelation, sharp and hungry, and completely unaware that learning was supposed to be difficult, which meant they simply weren't afraid of it. Hannah Prentice, in particular, had a mind that Elizabeth recognized with a feeling that was half pride and half grief. The particular feeling of recognizing in someone else something you had been yourself at that age, in a place that hadn't known what to do with you. You're very quick, Elizabeth told her one morning when Hannah had finished a calculation that most of the other children were still working through. Hannah looked up with the wary expression of a child who had been told she was too quick before and found it was not a compliment. Is that bad? It's very good, Elizabeth said. It means you need harder problems. She wrote another one on the page. Try that. Hannah looked at it. Then she looked at Elizabeth. Mrs. Ashford, she said with the careful correction of a child who was still learning the right form of address. Do ladies do this? The arithmetic and the land calculations and all of it? Elizabeth looked at the 9-year-old in front of her with the clear, serious face and the too quick mind and the wariness of a child who had already started learning to make herself smaller. "I do," Elizabeth said. "And I intend to keep doing it." Hannah considered this for a moment. Then she bent her head and went back to the problem. Elizabeth watched her for a second before turning to the next student. She did not let herself feel the full weight of that small exchange until that evening alone in the kitchen after the children had gone. Then she sat down and felt it, the specific, precise weight of what it meant to show a child that a thing was possible that the child had been afraid to want. She sat with it for a long time. Then she added 2 more arithmetic texts to her order to the Frankfurt bookseller. Caroline arrived on a Thursday in mid-March. She came by stage from Charlottesville, which was 3 days of hard travel, and Elizabeth could see the 3 days on her when she stepped down onto the Lexington Road, the weariness, the thinning at the face that was more than travel fatigue. Caroline had always been beautiful in the easy, abundant way of someone who doesn't have to work for it. She was still beautiful, but she looked like she had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and the weight showed. She saw Elizabeth waiting, and she stopped. Just stopped. Stood there in the March cold with her traveling case and looked at her sister with an expression that Elizabeth could not have described precisely except to say that it was entirely unguarded in a way Caroline's face had rarely been in her presence. "Lizzie," she said. Elizabeth said, "Come inside, you must be cold." She did not embrace her. She wasn't ready for that. But she opened the door, and Caroline went through it, and that was something. Frances had made coffee and excused herself to the front room with the tact of a woman who understood exactly when she wasn't needed. William was in the barn. It was just the 2 of them at the kitchen table with coffee between them that gave them both something to do with their hands. Caroline said, "You look well." "I am well," Elizabeth said. "The land Jonas mentioned to his brother, who mentioned, I heard you have over 100 acres now." 140, Elizabeth said. "And a school on Saturday mornings." Something crossed Caroline's face. Not quite guilt more complex than guilt more personal. The expression of someone confronting evidence of a thing they had underestimated. "You always were the one who could—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I was going to say something that sounds like a compliment, but is actually what I always said, to make myself feel better about the fact that you got less than you deserved." The silence that followed that was significant. Elizabeth set down her cup. "Say what you came to say, Caroline." Her sister looked at her. Her eyes were bright and not quite steady. "I knew," she said, "about the memory. I knew from the beginning it was false. I knew that Nathaniel remembered you. I knew what had happened between you and I." Her voice caught. "I told myself that you had never said it was anything serious between you. That you'd never told me, so I didn't know for certain. That I couldn't be held responsible for what I hadn't been told." "But you knew," Elizabeth said. "Yes." No hesitation, no softening. "I knew." "And the accident?" Caroline's hands tightened around her cup. "I didn't arrange it," she said. "That was Nathaniel's doing and his family. I didn't know about the doctor until afterward. But when I found out—" She stopped again. "I didn't stop it, I let it happen. Because I wanted him, and because I had always been the one who got what she wanted, and I didn't want to look at what it cost you." Her voice dropped. "I didn't want to look at what it cost you because I was afraid if I did, I would have to give him up." Elizabeth was very still. "That's the truth," Caroline said. "All of it. I practiced other versions on the way here, kinder ones that put the blame more on Nathaniel and less on me, and every one of them was a lie, and I am so tired of lies." Her eyes spilled over quickly, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment. "I lost the baby in August. I think you know that." "I heard," Elizabeth said quietly. "And when it happened?" Caroline steadied herself. "When it happened, the person I wanted was you. The person I have always wanted every time something went wrong was you. And I realized I had destroyed the very thing I needed most, because I was too selfish and too afraid to see what I was doing while I was doing it. She looked at Elizabeth across the table. I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I know I don't have the right to ask for that. I just needed you to know that I know what I did. The whole of it. Not the comfortable version. Elizabeth sat with it. All of it. The kitchen table. The coffee going cold, her sister's undone face, the specific and long-awaited weight of the truth finally spoken in her presence. She thought about 26 years. She thought about being the useful one, the capable one, the one who managed things and set things aside and made room. She thought about the way love in her family had always had conditions attached to it. Requirements, exchange rates, and how she had learned so early to love anyway, regardless of the terms, because the people were still her people. She thought about Hannah Prentice with her too quick mind and her wary face. I believe you, Elizabeth said finally, that you know what you did. Thank you, Caroline said, very quietly. That isn't forgiveness, Elizabeth said. I want to be clear about that. I don't know yet if I can forgive it. What I know is that I'm not going to carry the weight of hating you for it because I have too much else to carry that matters more. She looked at her sister. But I won't pretend it didn't happen. And I won't go back to the way things were, where I was the one who made room for everything. I'm not asking for that, Caroline said. What are you asking for? Caroline thought about it for a moment genuinely, the way a person thinks when they're trying to say something true rather than something that will achieve a desired effect. I'm asking for the possibility, she said. Not today, not now. Just the possibility that eventually we might be sisters in some form, some real form. She paused. Even if it looks different from before. Elizabeth looked at her. She thought about what it would mean to say yes to the possibility. Not the forgiveness, she wasn't there yet, and she knew it. But the door. The very slight, very careful, very conditional door. I'll think about it, she said. It was not a yes, but it was not a no. And Caroline, who knew her sister, understood that this was the most honest, and therefore the most meaningful thing Elizabeth could have offered her. She nodded once and wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, and they sat together in the quiet kitchen for a while. Not quite reconciled, and not quite strangers, which was something. Which was more than either of them had had that morning. The twist came from where she hadn't been looking. It always did. Nathaniel Crawford arrived in Lexington 2 weeks after Caroline left. Not for the Frankfurt Consortium this time, that business had concluded months ago. He came specifically with intention, and Elizabeth knew it the moment William came in from town on a Tuesday afternoon, with the particular expression of a man who has seen something he needs to tell his wife about. He's here, William said. Elizabeth didn't ask who. How do you know he's here for me? Because he asked for you by name at the Beaumont Hotel, William said. The innkeeper's wife told Mrs. Pratt, who told Frances, who told me. He paused. He knows you're here. He knows about the land. He knows about the school. His jaw was steady, but there was something in his eyes, not jealousy. She knew William well enough to know it wasn't that, more like a man bracing for something he'd rather not have to brace for. He asked if you were happy. She stared. He asked. The innkeeper's wife said he asked specifically whether Elizabeth Harrington, he called you by that name, not Ashford, was happy here. William sat down. What do you want to do? She stood in the kitchen, and she thought about the courthouse steps in November. The way he had said her name, Elizabeth, in the voice he had never quite allowed himself to use in his parlor, with the polished, courteous blankness. The way something had moved across his face too quickly. She thought about what it meant that he had asked if she was happy. Not whether she was prospering, not whether the land was doing well, whether she was happy. I'm not going to the hotel, she said. No, William agreed. But if he comes here? She stopped. Let him come. William looked at her. I'm not afraid of him, she said. I'm not angry at him in the way I was, and I think... She chose the next words carefully. I think there are things he needs to hear from me. Not for his sake, for mine. Are you sure? No, she said honestly. but I'm going to do it anyway." He came the following morning. She heard the horse on the road and knew before she looked. She set down what she was doing, the Saturday lesson plan. As it happened, arithmetic problems for Hannah Prentice, and stood up and walked to the door and opened it before he knocked. He looked at her from the bottom of the porch steps. 3 years had done to him what 18 months had not quite done in November. The change was more complete now, the tightening more settled. He looked like a man who had been living inside difficult choices for long enough that the choices had begun to show. "Elizabeth," he said. "Mr. Crawford," she said. "You can come in if you have something to say." He came in. He took off his hat. He stood in her kitchen with the Saturday lesson plan on the table, and the arithmetic texts stacked beside it, and the 2 coffee cups on the shelf that were hers and William's. And he looked around it for a moment with an expression she recognized as a man confronting an alternate version of a life he had been given the chance to choose. "You've built something real here," he said. "I have. I heard about the school. Word travels." He looked at his hat in his hands. "I came to tell you something," he said. "Not to ask anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm not here to, I know you're married. I know this is your life. I'm not." He stopped, regrouped. "I came because there's something I never said that I should have said, and I have found that not having said it has made it very difficult to sleep." She sat down. She gestured to the chair across from her. He sat. "Say it," she said. He said, "I remember everything." She looked at him. "I always did," he said. "Every Tuesday morning, every Thursday afternoon, the study, the maps, the accounts, all of it. The evening you said you don't have to hold it alone, and I knew right then I knew what I wanted, and I chose something else because I was a coward, and because my family's name felt larger to me in that moment than anything else." His voice was steady, but it cost him to keep it that way. "And then you walked out of my parlor and I watched you go, and I thought you'd stay. I thought you'd fight for it. Because you always did the sensible thing, and the sensible thing would have been to stay." "That's what you thought the sensible thing was," Elizabeth said. "For me to stay and accept it." "Yes," he said. "That is what I thought. And I have had 3 years to understand what that thought says about the way I saw you." He looked at her directly. "I didn't see you. I used you. I trusted you with my worst truths and my family's worst problems, and when it came time to choose, I chose the thing that cost me nothing and cost you everything. And then I had the breathtaking arrogance to assume you would be there when I eventually came around." Elizabeth said nothing. "You weren't there," he said. "You were gone, and everything you had been doing for my estate, all the management, all the guidance, it fell apart within a season because there was no one who understood it the way you did. And I had been too proud to acknowledge even to myself what you actually were to that place." He stopped. "What you were to me." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside she could hear the March wind in the trees, the particular sound of early spring moving through bare branches. "Nathaniel," she said, "what do you want me to say?" "Nothing," he said. "I don't want anything from you. I have no right to want anything from you. I came because I needed you to know that I know." He paused. "Your sister said the same thing to you, I understand, that she knows what she did." Elizabeth looked up sharply. "You spoke to Caroline. She told me she was coming to see you before she left." He held her gaze. "She's braver than I am. She got there first." "She is braver than you," Elizabeth said. "She always was in the ways that matter." He accepted that without flinching. "I know." She studied him across the table. This man who had once been the center of a particular gravity in her life, around whom everything had seemed to orient itself, who had seemed for a few months like the answer to a question she had been asking her whole life. She looked at him now and felt not nothing because she was honest enough to know it wasn't nothing but something much smaller and much less urgent than she had expected. The feeling of looking at a scar. It had been part of her once. It wasn't anymore. "I am not going to tell you that what you did was acceptable," she said. "It wasn't. You made me invisible deliberately, and you did it in public, and you let my family go along with it because it was convenient." She kept her voice level, not cold, just precise. "But I also want you to know that what you did sent me here. And here—" She looked at the kitchen, at the lesson plan, at the books, at the 2 coffee cups on the shelf. "Here is the best thing that ever happened to me. Not in spite of what you did, but in some complicated way I don't entirely have words for because of it." He looked at her. "That doesn't make it right," she said. "I want to be absolutely clear. It doesn't make what you did right, but it means I can look at it and not be destroyed by it." She paused. "And I need that to be enough for now. For both of us." He nodded slowly, once. "Is Caroline all right?" Elizabeth asked. The question came out before she'd decided to ask it, which was its own kind of answer about the conversation she'd had at this table 2 weeks ago. "She's managing," he said. "She's stronger than I've given her credit for." He paused. It is not a happy house. I want you to know that I take responsibility for that. The lie was mine. The plan was mine. Caroline made her choices, but the architecture of it was my doing." Elizabeth thought about that for a moment. About Caroline saying, "I told myself I didn't know for certain." About the ways a lie offered to someone who wants to be deceived becomes eventually the deceiver, and the deceived sharing the weight. "Fix it," Elizabeth said. "Not for me, not because I've told you to. Fix it because you have a wife who made terrible choices, partly because you built a structure that made terrible choices easier. And she's going to have to live in that house, and whatever happened, she doesn't deserve to live in it, broken." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Something between grief and something that was, if she was being honest, not entirely unlike respect. "I didn't come here expecting this," he said. "I know," Elizabeth said. "I didn't either." She stood up. He stood up. At the door, he stopped. "You said once," he said, "that you don't have to hold it alone." He paused. "You were right. I should have listened." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He put his hat on. He walked out the door, down the porch steps to his horse. He mounted without looking back. She watched him ride down the road and felt the last of it, the last of the weight she had been carrying in the part of herself that wasn't quite the land. Not quite the school, not quite the marriage, but the older, quieter part that was just Elizabeth, just the girl from the kitchen garden who had been asked to give things away her whole life. She felt it shift, not disappear. She didn't believe in the kind of forgiveness that made things disappear, but shift the way a stone shifts when the river moves it, when enough water has passed over it long enough that it finds a new resting place, and there it stays, worn smooth. William came in from the barn 20 minutes later. He found her at the table, the lesson plan in front of her, writing a new arithmetic problem for Hannah Prentice. He looked at her. He didn't ask how it went. He asked, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "Really?" She looked up. "Really," she said, and meant it in the deepest, most accurate sense of the word. "Really." He nodded once and poured himself coffee and sat down across from her, and the kitchen settled back into the comfortable, ordinary peace of a Thursday morning in March, and Elizabeth Harrington Ashford picked up her pen and went back to work. Spring came to Kentucky the way it always did, suddenly and without apology. One morning the ground was still iron hard with the last of the winter frost, and the next morning the red-winged blackbirds were back in the fence posts, and the mud along the creek was soft, and the whole county smelled like turned earth and possibility. Elizabeth had been watching for it the way she watched for everything she cared about, not anxiously, but with the steady, patient attention of a woman who had learned that good things did not always announce themselves in advance. Sometimes they simply arrived, and the best thing you could do was be ready. She was ready. The spring planting of 1814 was the most ambitious she had attempted. She had spent the winter drawing up the plan with the same precision she had once brought to the Crawford estate accounts, and the plan covered all 140 acres, with the detail of a military campaign, which fields went to winter wheat holdover, which to corn, which she was resting for the fall, and which she was finally putting to the tobacco crop she had been building toward since the second parcel. Tobacco was money in this county. She had known that from the beginning. She had also known she would not plant it until the soil was right, and the plan was right, and she was ready to manage the complexity of it. And now all three of those things were true. Caleb Prentice looked at the full plan the morning she spread it on the kitchen table and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This is a real operation now, Miss Elizabeth." "It always was," she said. "It just took time to grow into itself." He looked at her. "You going to be all right managing all of this?" "It's a lot." "Caleb," she said, "I managed the Crawford estate at 22, with no credit and no title, and no one who publicly acknowledged I was doing it. I think I can manage my own 140 acres with my name on the deed." He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she said. "Start with the South Tobacco Field. I want the ground turned by Thursday." He went. She looked at the plan for one more moment at the shape of it. The whole connected, considered, deliberate shape of it, and felt something that she had stopped questioning by now, because it was simply and reliably true. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. Then she rolled up the plan and went to teach her Saturday school, which was on a Thursday now because she had more students than Saturday mornings could hold. The Saturday school had outgrown the kitchen table in February. She had not seen it coming, or rather, she had seen it coming, and had not yet arranged her mind around what it meant. The 12 students had become 16, and 16 had become 22. And 22 children in a kitchen was not a school, it was a problem, and Elizabeth solved problems. She solved this one by speaking to the Methodist minister, a man named Reverend Cook, who had a storage room behind the church that he was not using, and who turned out under his formal churchman's exterior to have a genuine and uncomplicated belief that children should be educated regardless of their family's financial position. "I can offer the room," he said when she laid out the proposal. "I cannot offer much else." "The room is what I need," she said. "I'll manage the rest." The rest, as it turned out, included 6 borrowed chairs, 2 proper desks donated by William, 3 arithmetic texts purchased with Elizabeth's own money, and a chalkboard that Jonas Prentice built himself from pine planks and black paint on a Sunday afternoon, because she had mentioned in passing that she needed one. She did not mention it again. She didn't need to. That was the thing she had discovered about the community she had spent 18 months becoming part of it. Worked the way good land worked, quietly through a network of roots. You couldn't always see producing things above ground that seemed to come from nowhere, but were in fact the result of everything that had been put in below. She had put a great deal in below. On the first morning in the church room, 22 children ranged in age from 7 to 14 sat in uneven rows on borrowed chairs and looked at her, and she looked back at them, and she felt with a specificity that nearly undid her the weight of what it meant to be the person at the front of that room. She had been Hannah Prentice once. She had been the child with the too quick mind in a place that didn't know what to do with it, and she could not go back and fix, that could not give that child more than she had been given. But she could stand in this room, in this March light, and be for 22 children the thing she had needed and not had. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, Mrs. Ashford," 22 voices said, with the ragged, earnest unison of children who are trying. She picked up her chalk. "Let's get to work," she said. Yuck. The news about Nathaniel Crawford's final reckoning reached Lexington in April, and it arrived with the completeness of something that had been building for a long time and had finally resolved. He was selling the main estate, not the western parcels, those had been gone since the previous year. The house itself, the primary holding. The Crawford name in Virginia would persist technically because there were cousins, but the estate that Nathaniel's father had built, and that Nathaniel had sworn at his father's deathbed to hold together with his bare hands, that was gone. Elizabeth heard it from Frances, who heard it from Mrs. Pratt, who had it directly from her husband, the lawyer who had been contacted about the Kentucky land records in connection with a creditor settlement. She sat with it for a long moment after Frances told her. She did not feel what she expected to feel. She had privately carefully thought that when this news came, she might feel something triumphant. Not a vindictive triumph, not the sharp pleasure of watching someone get what they deserved, but some smaller, more human feeling of balance restored. Justice, even a partial justice, arriving at last. She didn't. What she felt was closer to grief. Not for him, not for Nathaniel Crawford specifically, who had made his choices with full knowledge of what they were, but for the father who had built the estate, for the land itself, which had done nothing wrong, for the idea of a thing lasting which she realized believed in the idea that if you tended something well enough it would hold. She had held her piece of it. She had taken everything she learned in those years and brought it here and built something that was holding and would keep holding because it was built right. His hadn't held, not because the land was wrong, because the foundation had been wrong from the beginning. "Are you all right?" Frances asked. "I'm thinking," Elizabeth said. About the difference between justice and outcome," Elizabeth said. "I spent a long time thinking they were the same thing. That if I did things right, the outcome would be right. That if someone did things wrong, they'd eventually pay for it in kind." She paused. "It doesn't work that cleanly." "No," Frances said. "It doesn't. He didn't lose the estate because he lied to me," Elizabeth said. "He lost it because he mismanaged it for 3 years without me, and before that his father had mismanaged it for 20, and the lie was only one thread in a much larger knot." She looked at her aunt. "That's harder to sit with than a clean reckoning." "Most true things are," Frances said. Elizabeth picked up her coffee. "I'm going to write to Caroline," she said. Frances raised an eyebrow. "Not to comfort her," Elizabeth said. "To tell her that if she ever needs practical advice about what comes next, about money, about property, about managing a situation she didn't entirely create, I'm available." She paused. "Not because I've forgiven everything, but because she's my sister, and she's going to be navigating something she's not equipped for, and I can't—" She stopped. "I can't be my mother. I can't stand at the edge of the kitchen garden in my good shoes and not step onto the soil because it might dirty them." Frances was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother loved you." "I know. She just didn't know how to step in." "I know that too," Elizabeth said. "But I know how, and I'm going to." She wrote the letter that afternoon, short and practical, which was the language Caroline would understand best, coming from her, not warmth, not yet, but competence, offered freely. Something real. It was the most honest thing she had ever offered her sister. The twist that changed everything came in May, and it came not from Virginia, not from Nathaniel Crawford, not from any direction she had been watching. It came from William. He came home on a Tuesday, not a Thursday, not his usual rhythm, and she knew before he was through the door that something had shifted because he had the expression of a man who had been thinking about something very carefully for a long time and had finally finished thinking. He sat down at the kitchen table. She sat across from him. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." She folded her hands. "All right. I've been offered a partnership," he said. "Land consortium out of Frankfurt, the same group Crawford was involved with last year, actually different configuration now. They want a Kentucky-based partner with solid holdings and a proven record." He paused. "The terms are good, better than good. It would double our operational capacity within 2 years. But," she said, because there was clearly a but, "the lead partner is a man named Harcastle," William said. "He's out of Philadelphia. He's effective, and he's honest about money, and he's a man who has specific views about how a partnership operation should be structured." He met her eyes. "He was very direct with me in Frankfurt. He said that if we entered the partnership, he expected the operational decisions to run through one partner, one voice." Elizabeth was quiet. "He meant me," William said. "He was clear about that. He's not a bad man, Elizabeth. He's a man of his time, and his time says that a woman doesn't sit at the partnership table." She looked at her husband. She thought about the arithmetic texts on the church room shelf. She thought about the grain contract with her name on it. She thought about the 140 acres and the deed signed in her hand, and the fact that she had been the silent voice behind half a county's worth of business for 3 years, and she was done with being silent. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him I needed to speak with my wife before I gave him an answer," William said. He looked at me like I'd said something remarkable. "What are you going to tell him?" William held her gaze. "I'm going to tell him that my wife is my partner in the operational sense of the word, that she has been since before we were married, that the holdings we would be bringing to this consortium were built primarily by her, and that if the partnership requires her to be invisible, then we are not interested." He paused. "Unless you want this, Elizabeth. Unless the financial terms are compelling enough that you want me to find a way to—" "No," she said, flat and clear and immediate. "Good," he said. "That's what I thought." She looked at him across the table, at this man who had driven to Frankfurt, and sat across from a Philadelphia businessman, and said, "I need to speak with my wife," as though it was the most ordinary sentence in the world, which to him she knew it genuinely was. "William," she said. "Yes." "You know this will likely cost us the partnership." "I know." "And you're all right with that?" "Elizabeth," he said, "I am not interested in building something that requires you to be smaller than you are. I never have been. That is not the arrangement I signed up for, and it is not the arrangement I intend to operate." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if we propose a different structure?" He looked at her. "What if we go back to Hardcastle?" she said. And there was something in her voice now, the particular quality that came into it when she was building a plan, that focused, energized precision. "And we propose a structure where I operate as a named consultant to the consortium rather than a formal partner. Not because I'm willing to be invisible, I'm not, but because it achieves the same thing by a different mechanism, one that a man like Hardcastle can present to his Philadelphia contacts without losing face." William was quiet for a moment. "You'd settle for that." "I would not settle," she said precisely. "I would choose it strategically because the goal is influence and outcome, not title. I have been the unnamed force behind operational decisions my entire professional life. I know how to make a structure work from an unconventional position." She looked at him. "What I will not do is disappear. My name, my involvement, my contributions, those are visible. He can call me what he likes, but he will know, and William, everyone will know where the thinking came from." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're better at this than I am," he said. "At some things," she said. "At others, you're better than me. That's rather the point of a partnership." He almost laughed. "All right, Mrs. Ashford. Draw up the proposal and I'll take it back to Frankfurt." "I'll have it ready by Thursday," she said, and picked up her pen. Hardcastle accepted the modified structure, which surprised William and did not surprise Elizabeth in the least. She had understood from the information William had given her about the man that he was fundamentally practical, that his objection to her at the table was not personal, but procedural, the reflex of a man operating within the conventions of his world rather than the conviction of a man who believed those conventions were correct. When presented with a structure that achieved everything he needed while navigating his conventions, he took it without significant resistance. What he had not anticipated, what became clear over the first 6 months of the consortium's operation, was that the consultant he had agreed to was not a courtesy arrangement. Elizabeth worked with a thoroughness and precision that made itself felt through every decision the partnership made, and even Hardcastle, who had spent 50 years in business without once having a serious professional conversation with a woman, found himself directing questions toward Frankfurt on Thursday afternoons when he knew she would be available. He never said anything about it. He didn't have to. The results said it for him. Hannah Prentice turned 11 in July, and Elizabeth gave her a gift, a surveying text properly bound with a note inside that said, "For the woman you are going to be." Hannah read the note twice, standing in the church room doorway on a Tuesday morning, and looked up at Elizabeth with the serious, clear-eyed expression that had not changed since she was 9 and solving arithmetic problems 3 grades above her age. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, "did someone give you a book like this when you were my age?" "No," Elizabeth said. "Why not?" Because no one believed I would use it. Hannah thought about that. That was wrong of them. Yes, Elizabeth said. It was. I'm going to use it, Hannah said. I know you are, Elizabeth said. That's why I gave it to you. Hannah held the book against her chest with both arms, the way children hold things they intend to keep, and walked into the church room to her seat, and Elizabeth watched her go, and felt the specific, irreplaceable satisfaction of a chain being broken. Not the chain of her own history, that had been broken the morning she set a ring on a table and walked out a door in Virginia. But the longer chain, the older one, the one that said a girl with a quick mind and no name on a deed, has nothing coming to her. That chain, broken one child at a time on Tuesday and Thursday mornings in a church room in Lexington, Kentucky. Frances died in September. She went quietly in her sleep on a Sunday night and was found in the morning by her maid with her hands folded on the blanket and the expression of a woman who had decided she was finished and had gone ahead and finished, which was entirely consistent with everything else about her. Elizabeth sat with her for a long time before she let anyone else in. She held her aunt's hand, already cold, already past anything Elizabeth could give her, and sat in the silence of the room and thought about a woman who had been waiting 5 years for her niece to leave a house that was shrinking her, who had set a land auction notice on a breakfast table without preamble, who had signed a deed as co-purchaser without ceremony, who had said, "I am 61 years old, and I have no children, and I have been watching the women in this family give things away their entire lives with the brisk, furious love of someone who had been giving things away themselves and knew exactly what it cost." "You started this," Elizabeth said quietly, to the room, to the hands, to whatever was still present. She didn't know if anything was. She hoped so. She stayed until the morning light changed, and then she went and told William, and the day moved forward, the way days did, carrying everything with it. Frances left the house and its contents to Elizabeth, which surprised no one who had known Frances. She also left a letter sealed which Elizabeth opened alone at the kitchen table on the evening after the funeral. It was 3 sentences. "You came to my door with a straight back and no tears, and I knew you were going to be all right. I am glad I got to see it. Don't let anyone make you smaller. You never did after that first summer, and I was so proud of you I could hardly stand it." Elizabeth folded the letter. She held it in both hands. She did not cry, which was what Frances would have expected, and then she did cry, which was what the moment required, and those two things were both true at once, and she held them both without trying to resolve them, because some things in life were not resolvable and did not need to be. The letter from Caroline came in October, not 4 desperate lines this time, 4 pages careful and considered, and more like the Caroline Elizabeth remembered from before everything, the sister she had grown up with, the one who had laughed easily and sat by fires and braided Elizabeth's hair on Sunday evenings when they were girls. That Caroline writing through the distance of everything that had happened, still recognizable underneath it all. She wrote about leaving Virginia, about the decision she and Nathaniel had made separately, she said, and then together, that the estate sale was not a failure, but a release. She wrote about Nathaniel's family in Maryland, where they were going to stay through the winter. She wrote that Nathaniel had started quietly to look for work that used his actual knowledge of land rather than his family's name, and that this was the first time in her experience of him that he had seemed like a man acting from himself rather than from his father's expectations. Then she wrote, "I think he might become someone worth knowing, Lizzie. I don't know yet. But I think he might. And I think I might too if I'm given the room to figure out who that is." And then at the bottom of the 4th page, in handwriting that was slightly less composed than the rest, as though she had added it after putting the letter down and coming back, "I have been thinking about what you said, about being sisters in some real form, even if it looks different. I would like that. If you would." Elizabeth set the letter down. She sat with it for a full minute. Then she picked up her pen and wrote back, not 4 pages, not immediately, because some things needed to grow into themselves before they were ready, but enough. 1.5 pages, real things. her own words unguarded for the first time in 3 years. She said she was glad Nathaniel was finding his way. She said she meant that, and she did. She said the school had 26 students now, and Hannah Prentice was going to be someone remarkable. She said Frances was gone, and she missed her every day. She said William was well, and the consortium's first full year had exceeded projections, and the South Tobacco field had produced beyond anything she had planned for. And at the end, she wrote, "Yes, Caroline, I would like that too. Let's try." She sealed it before she could second-guess it. It was, she thought, the bravest thing she'd written since the deed of sale. 5 years after the morning, she had stood on those church steps and not cried. Elizabeth Harrington. Ashford sat at the head of the Frankfurt Land Consortium's Autumn Review, not as a consultant listed by courtesy, but as a named operational partner. A change Hardcastle himself had proposed 6 months earlier, with the air of a man correcting a clerical error that had gone on too long. She was 31 years old. She had 220 acres under her management, a school with 31 students and a waiting list, a husband who had never once asked her to be less than she was, and a letter from her sister on her desk that had arrived the previous week with a sketch inside it. A rough pencil drawing of a child, a boy about 2 years old with Caroline's coloring and a very serious expression. "His name is Thomas," the letter said. "He was born in June. He is extremely opinionated for someone who cannot yet read, and I thought you should know him." Elizabeth had looked at that drawing for a long time. She had thought about the baby they had lost in August of 1813, the grief she had felt on a street in November for a child she had never met. She had thought about what it meant that life kept moving, kept producing, kept offering, even after the worst of things, something new to love. She had pinned the sketch to the wall above her desk next to the arithmetic problem she had written for Hannah Prentice's first lesson, which she had kept for reasons she didn't need to explain. At the consortium meeting, Hardcastle presented the year's figures. When he finished, he looked down the table at Elizabeth, the instinct of a man who had spent 18 months learning where the real thinking came from, and said, "Mrs. Ashford, your assessment." She looked at the figures. She thought about a woman who had walked into a courthouse in Lexington with pooled savings and a straight back and an absolute refusal to be invisible. She thought about 2 parcels becoming 3, 3 becoming 140, 140, becoming 220, and still growing. She thought about Frances's 3 sentences. She thought about Hannah's hands holding a surveying text against her chest. She spoke clearly without hedging, without the performance of a woman managing how much space she was allowed to take up, without any of the old careful shrinking that had been required of her for so long that she had once mistaken it for modesty. She said what she thought, all of it, in full. The room listened. Afterward, a young man, a new member barely 25 from a family in Ohio, leaned over to the man next to him and said quietly, "Who is she?" The man next to him said, "That's Elizabeth Harrington. She built the Kentucky operation from nothing." "Harrington," the young man said. "I thought her name was Ashford." "Both," the man said simply. She kept both. Elizabeth, who had very good hearing, and always had heard this from across the table. She did not smile. She picked up her pen and went back to work, because that was who she was, a woman who had been made invisible and had refused to stay that way, who had walked out of one life and built another with her own hands, who had loved well and been hurt badly and chosen every single day to keep walking forward. She had never needed anyone to choose her. She had chosen herself. And the world slowly then, all at once, the way all real things change, had learned to call her by her name.